Welcome back to Late War Russia is fucking scary. Today's topic is Pomerania, an ancient land mostly known for fish, adorable puppies, and Kashubians. To recap from the last video, Prussia isn't having a good time. Such a bad time, in fact, that second Belarusian front commander, Konstantin Rokossovsky, was told to go assert his dominance in Pomerania because Zhukov by this point is extremely close to Berlin. But his flanks are unsecured and we need a reason to prolong this war for dramatic reasons. The original plan was to take Berlin in February, but the Germans are masochists who take pleasure in their defeat being slow and agonizing, so this video actually starts with a German offensive called Operation Solstice. Heinz Guderian originally planned for this operation to be pretty big, and it would attempt to cut off the forward elements of Zhukov's army. However, Hitler is Hitler, and he refused to have troops pulled from other places, most notably Courland, with an entire army group just sitting there still, so the attack became a much smaller one. Basically what happened was they took a bunch of SS divisions along with some regular army guys, put them under command of a certain Felix Steiner, and told him to fuck the Soviets up. They attacked south from Stargard on February 15th and made some okay progress but ultimately stalled out, with the Soviets counterattacking a few days later, causing the offensive to be halted. It did technically accomplish its goal, holding off an attack on Berlin while Zhukov decided to abolish Pomerania to shore up his flank. Now it was Rokossovsky's turn to attack, and the Germans were about to have a very bad day. Nobody is fucking around at this point. Rokossovsky brought 1,000,000 men to violate the autonomy of Pomerania. However, they did at least have two main issues. One, the Kriegsmarine. Remember Operation Hannibal? Well, that's happening here too, although a whole lot less than in Prussia. Two, Danzig. You know how they had to besiege Königsberg for a couple months and then pull a Stalingrad and fight for every street? Well, there's actually two Königsbergs, fuck you. However, the Soviets had become very stubborn at this point, and no amount of German preparations, obstacles, or shitty urban fighting were about to get in their way. The Germans were honestly in a truly terrible position. The terrain is rather hard to defend on, and they were always outnumbered. Their forces were under overall command of Colonel General Walter Weiss, and his force mainly consisted of a chunk of the Second Army under good old von Sauken. If you were wondering why I kinda glossed over him last time, it's because he is more important here. He also had what parts of the now essentially destroyed 3rd Panzer Army managed to escape from East Prussia. All of his forces were severely understrength, and in all honesty could hardly even be considered a cohesive unit. For these reasons, Weiss requested numerous times to fall back further into Germany, since the situation was totally untenable by this point. You should already know what Hitler's response to this was. The front was pretty large, too. The main drive by the 2nd Belarusian would rush straight for the town of Koslin on the Baltic coast to cut the 2nd Army off, while the 1st Belarusian would take a part of its right flank and throw it in the general direction of Stettin to cut off the rest. In theory, this would split the army into like 3 different encirclements that could be dealt with at their leisure. In practice, this actually worked. The attack would begin on February 24th, with the first units sent in being those of the 19th Army under some guy called Kozlov. He doesn't matter because he's immediately fired after the Germans were somehow able to check his advance. So on the 26th, they sent the guys who could actually get shit done, and they proceeded to get shit done, breaking through at Baldenburg and Neustetten and seriously threatening to just drive to the coast since there was basically nothing in between them at that point. By March 4th, they accomplished this, hitting the Baltic Sea, trapping the 2nd Army in a bunch of straggler formations. The now stuck troops had no ideas of breaking out because the strength to do that simply didn't exist, so they decided to at least give themselves a chance, withdrawing towards Danzig to make a stand there. Meanwhile, Zhukov's troops began their attack on the 1st of March, attacking further west near Rietz, again pushing very quickly towards the coast. All of the German commanders knew shit had hit the fan, but all requests to get out were denied, forcing a very shaky retreat of the right flank of the 3rd Panzer Army towards Stettin. Yeah, they really can't catch a break. They got hammered during their retreat, and they functionally have ceased to exist as a combat unit. It's really the same story as the Eastern attack. Russians hit the Baltic, and now all the Germans that didn't get to Stettin are now stucker than stuck. Nobody has the strength to support a breakout, and they are split between multiple different pockets. The 10th SS Corps of the 3rd Panzer Army was surrounded near Dromborg and was quickly destroyed, and as the pockets began to close, only 2 major obstacles for the attackers remained, being the cities of Kolberg and Danzig. Go figure. We'll start with Kolberg because it happens first. So on March 4th, the city was surrounded and cut off, with the only way in and out being by sea. The place was declared a Festung because it was pretty important to naval supply and evacuation efforts further east. After it was cut off, there was a great deal of effort in evacuating people, especially refugees, who had now flooded the place. You see, the news of the Soviets doing some naughty things in Prussia spread very quickly, so most civilians were making haste to get the hell out of their way. The Germans would put up very significant fight here, and it makes sense when you consider who the main forces guarding it were. Most notably was the 33rd SS Waffen Grenadier Division, more well known as the SS Division Charlemagne. Yeah, the Frenchies are here. They were almost totally annihilated near Hammerstein on February 25th, but those that managed to escape posted up in Kolberg. There was also the 15th SS Waffen Grenadier Division, a shattered formation of Latvian conscripts who had barely escaped the collapse of Army Group North. And again, what was left of the left flank of the 3rd Panzer. Also Volkssturm guys, but they don't really matter. As for the attackers, there were some Russians, but the main attacks to take the city were conducted by the Polish First Army, and they were very excited to fuck up some Germans. The battle for the city wasn't really all that interesting. It's pretty standard urban fighting. The Germans had a couple of ships as well for gun support, but that really couldn't save them. The Russians attacked on the 4th, but were thrown back, so they told the Poles to do it because they didn't really give a shit. They attacked again on the 8th, but this too was repulsed, buying valuable time to evacuate people. Another attack took place on the 12th, and again on the 15th, and finally they broke through, taking the main barracks that the defenders were using, granting them a significant foothold. The Germans pulled themselves into a tighter ring around the inner city and the port, but by the 16th this too had been breached, with the Poles destroying an armored train of all things in the process. On the 17th, the Germans finally broke, retreating to the port and evacuating as many troops as possible, with the city finally being taken. 80% of the city was destroyed in the fighting, and these brutal urban brawls were becoming more and more common as Germany came closer and closer to defeat. Ah, fuck, Danzig is still there. Rokossovsky is back for this one, and so is Dietrich von Salken. The Soviets waltzed up on March 15th and kinda just loomed there for a couple of days. The city was full of panicked refugees desperate to escape by sea. The attackers, as usual, didn't really care, so they just did like they did at Königsberg, shelling and bombing the city for a few days. The Soviet plan was the tried and tested rush for the sea and cut the defenders in half, and that's exactly what they did. The only thing really standing in their way was the exhausted and thoroughly dicked down remnants of the Second Army, and while they did put up resistance, it wasn't really enough to actually stand a chance. Their only goal was to hold so as many people could get out as possible. By the 19th, Soviet units had arrived at a town at the relative midpoint between Danzig and Gdynia, and by the 22nd it had fallen and they reached the sea, splitting the front in two. The garrison at Gdynia was crushed on the 26th, and those that could escape being evacuated to the Hel Peninsula, where they would sit until they could be pulled out near the end of the war. While this was happening, Danzig itself was under heavy and constant assaults, complete with more street-to-street fighting. Finally, though, on the 30th, Danzig would fall, and what was left of the Second Army dipped to continue holding out on the peninsula and near the mouth of the Vistula. Oh, and the Soviets sacked the city, who would have fucking guessed. 1 week later, the Soviets decided that they couldn't be bothered to hunt down Salkin and his army because they really weren't an issue anymore, so they declared the operation a success and left to go prepare to fuck up Berlin. Yeah, the Pomeranian Offensive was much less grand than that of East Prussia. However, they were essentially the same battle, just in two different places. Like I said in the last video, Salkin would surrender with his troops on May 10th, along with the guys who held the Hel Peninsula for evacuation to the very end. Casualties were pretty standard. Around 55,000 killed and 180,000 wounded. Polish casualties in Kolberg are estimated at about 1,200 dead and 3,000 wounded. By Soviet standards, these numbers are pretty light, all things considered. Exact numbers for the Germans are unknown, go figure, but since the vast majority of the armies that started the battle were surrounded and destroyed or heavily battered, we can assume that they took a not insignificant number. Large numbers of their forces were able to escape by sea from Kolberg and Danzig, but they wouldn't really be combat capable in any way, and the war would still be lost. After the war, the entire region was given to Poland, and the vast majority of the German population was expelled. The Poles were not exactly in the mood to show leniency to the guys who tried to exterminate them, after all. Because of their participation in the taking of Kolberg, the battle is fairly well set in their history, with multiple films and documentaries made about the battle. That is pretty much it for this particular battle, or series of battles, I guess. Like I said earlier, it's basically East Prussia, but a little bit to the left. It essentially served as a distraction that allowed the Germans to prepare in Berlin for a couple more months. Because let's be real, nothing was going to stop the Soviets at this point, and Pomerania essentially served as a minor inconvenience that was sorted out rather quickly. Anyways, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.